Hello everyone and welcome to this video on political risks. We're going to be defining political risks as well as taking a look at the four major categories of political risk. So if we start just by asking that basic question of what are political risks, well, essentially they're risks that derive in some way from political systems within any given country. So organizations and international businesses will examine a wide range of risks when they consider moving into a new market or operating in a new country. Some of those are going to be commercial risks, so looking at the commercial marketplace, competitors and so on. Some of those risks are going to be related to how they operate across borders, so things like currency risk and exchange risk. But some of those risks are going to be political risks. So this isn't examining the pros and cons of different political systems or benefits or drawbacks of a political system, but rather unknown elements which may or may not happen. So a risk is a future event which may happen, but is not certain to happen. So different types of political systems will give birth to different types of political risks, and one of the important aspects of moving into a new market or continuing to operate in a given market or a given country for international businesses is to understand how the political system in that country operates and what the levels of political risk actually are. Now that is fairly abstract, so we're going to make that a little bit more concrete by looking at the four major types or categories of political risk. So we have catastrophic risk, procedural risk, distributive risk, and lastly systemic risk. So organizations and international businesses will be evaluating each of these four categories of risk when they consider both their existing operations in other countries, as well as when they consider whether or not to move into a new market or enter a new country. So let's start working our way through these. So if we begin with the first, which is catastrophic risk, and look at what this is exactly. So catastrophic risk essentially is the risk that your entire investment in a given country will effectively be wiped out through some kind of severe crisis. This can be a severe economic crisis, political or financial crisis, and some of the common reasons why this would happen. So war, external war, internal civil conflict, major financial crisis, meltdown of the economic system. So anything which is going to be catastrophic or wipe out your entire investment. So a good example of this over the last 5 or 6 years would be the relatively small but still significant foreign investments in Syria. So foreign investments in Syria, which are located primarily or exclusively in Damascus, the capital, which has maintained the previous government, or the current government, I guess, of Syria by Bashar al-Assad, has maintained control. Those foreign investments are relatively stable, but any investments outside of Damascus in Homs or other areas of Syria, either devastated through active bombings or destroyed, or rendered inoperable. So normal commerce, normal operations simply cannot continue when you look at the kind of all-encompassing civil war that the majority of regions of Syria has experienced. So the risk of this kind of destructive civil conflict would be termed catastrophic risk. So any organizations or international businesses looking to invest in a new country will be evaluating the risk to their investment overall, and the degree of political stability or the political management of the economy to evaluate the risk of things like economic mismanagement and economic meltdown. We have a similar thing. The risk of a catastrophic risk in Kenya was heightened significantly after election violence in 2007 briefly threatened to really damage the country's political stability and brought to light a lot of latent tensions within Kenya. So catastrophic risk can rise and fall depending on the degree or the likelihood of the risk of your entire investment in that country suffering irreversible damage. Now, that's a fairly dramatic example of political risk, but we also have more subtle examples that international businesses must be mindful of and must monitor, most importantly. So our second example here is procedural risk, and this is a formal term for what we commonly call corruption. So corruption here is defined as the risk of a given stated procedure being either subverted or ignored. So if we say something like a government tender, where companies are supposed to bid for government contracts, so the process, the procedure on paper would be different companies will submit tenders with offers to do the work for a certain price or a certain cost, and then the government makes a transparent decision based on the merits of each tender. But if there's a significant risk that one of those companies is simply going to pay a bribe in order to win that government contract, that means that procedure on paper has been subverted. It's not being followed. It is the stated procedure, and the government may even pretend that it's being followed, but in reality is being subverted, and the company that pays a bribe is going to win that contract. So we can define corruption in this way, of stated procedures being subverted or ignored, and this is a risk which really derives from the health of the political system in place. And we've got lots of examples of this from pretty much every country in the world. So a particularly famous example is a bureaucratic Raj in India, as it's often known. So a very complex, large bureaucracy, both at national and state levels in India, creates lots of procedural risk, and there's lots of documented corruption and bribery within the system. So organizations considering moving into India or currently operating in India have to either price this in or consider the impacts of this on their business. One of the reasons why procedural risk will always be an ultimate negative is that even though single companies can benefit from bribery and corruption, they can bribe their way to lucrative contracts, or they can bribe their way out of legal trouble. But ultimately, when you consider the systemic impacts on the entire marketplace or the entire country, it is wholly negative. It adds additional costs, and that's just an economic argument. There's also obviously the moral argument as well against bribery and corruption. But from an economic standpoint, you have your general costs, so you have the costs of doing the actual work that needs to be done. But if there's a widespread culture of bribery or corruption, then every company that's operating in that area will have to price this in. This is an additional cost. So as well as the cost of the standard permits you need for construction, the labor and the materials for your construction project, you also have to price in bribes at every level to get all of the paperwork through. That's adding additional costs that are not productive, that are not going to result in returns. So using better materials will give you a better product or a better service, but paying additional bribes will not impact the actual work that's being done. So they're non-productive costs. I do want to just briefly point out here that while there is a perception that procedural risk is really a problem of the global south or the developing world or the third world, however you want to term it, this would really be a mistake for a couple of major reasons. If you just look over the last 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency in the US, it has certainly brought a lot of subverted and ignored procedures in the US to light. It's certainly made it very obvious where there is fairly obvious, for example, the pardon scheme, fairly obvious corruption. But as well as those kinds of high profile examples of corruption in the global north, or what we can term the developed or the rich world, or even the Western world, there's also a quite significant layer of corruption, with one major difference from the corruption that you may experience in places like Pakistan or Nigeria. Generally speaking, the corruption and the procedural risk in, for example, Pakistan and Nigeria will exist at a level which is visible to pretty much all of these citizens of the country and anyone in the country. So if you have been to Pakistan, pretty much an hour's drive away from the airport and the major center of government in Islamabad, you're going to quickly experience police officers stopping you, asking you for bribes. It's a very common experience to experience this even in the airport itself. So corruption is very much easily visible and easily identifiable. When it comes to corruption in the UK, this is not the kind of corruption and procedural risk you'll experience. You're not going to be able to bribe a police officer. You're not going to experience that kind of low-level corruption in Heathrow Airport or Luton Airport. But this doesn't mean that procedural risk is absent. This is far from the case. Lots of high-profile examples, as well as persistent examples of procedural risk when it comes to more mundane matters. So you can look up the examples of BAE Systems corruption probe with Saudi Arabia that the UK Foreign Office shut down on the grounds of national security. We already know about this because one of the people involved actually leaked the letter which ordered the Serious Fraud Office, or the Serious Crimes Office, to stop the investigation on the grounds of national security. A fairly obvious example of not only corruption on the part of a British company, but also complicity by the government in order to hush it up. You've got a lot of examples of corruption simply in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where you have millions upon millions of pounds of UK government contracts going to Tory party donors, people that have very little justifiable expertise, with the exception of being friends with some MP or another. I think a company, PestFix, again, well worth looking this up online, company called PestFix, with no track record or no experience in PPE, personal protective equipment procurement, was actually given something like a 48 or some very expensive contract, and there was no justifiable, clear and obvious reason why this was so, except they were moving in the same social circles as the current Tory or Conservative government. So it would be a major mistake to think that procedural risk is primarily or exclusively a problem of the global south. That would misunderstand how countries in the global north actually operate. So different types of procedural risk, absolutely, but that doesn't mean that there is no procedural risk in the global north at all. So if we move to our third type of risk, which is distributive risk, and this, as the name implies, is the risk to businesses, and obviously particularly international businesses, associated with how governments and political systems actually manage the distribution of wealth, which in pretty much every country is done primarily through taxation and government spending, as well as resource allocation. So increased taxation, which is particularly aimed at obviously businesses and commercial interactions and commercial activity, that is going to result in a higher distributive risk. Whereas if you have far lower levels of taxation and far lower levels of redistributive policies, so redistributive policies can involve the distribution or the redistribution of wealth and money through other means other than just tax codes. So requirements for organizations who want to engage in activity A, which is a revenue generating activity, to also engage in a set amount of activity B, which may be an activity which gains which serves some kind of community or social purpose. So any country with low levels of distributive policies and low levels or relatively low levels of tax will result in a lower distributive risk. So here we're looking at the ability of political systems to really control the allocation of resources and taxation and redistribution of wealth. And obviously, international businesses would prefer to have less of their wealth taxed, less of their revenue tax, and far less potent redistributive policies. So low distributive risk would be the major benefit in these kinds of countries. If we move on and now look at the last of our four major risks, we have systemic risk. Now, this is not really a particular type of risk in a particular type of risk in the same way procedural risk is essentially corruption, but rather this is a risk which affects an entire country entire market or industry. So if, for example, you're a company that deals primarily in petroleum or oil products, and a country that you're considering entering into has a political system which is moving towards increased regulation of oil and gas products in order to curb climate control or to achieve their targets under the Paris climate change accords, that would increase your systemic risk. So that risk is not going to be targeted at your company specifically. It's not going to be something which singles your company out. However, it will be a risk that's going to affect your entire market or industry in a negative way. So harmful government policies, what international businesses regard as excessive regulation, although we're going to see in our reading that the understanding and interpretation of excessive regulation can be vastly different from what the population of that country would regard as excessive regulation, and shifts of economic direction, monetary or fiscal policy, and so on can really increase the systemic risk to entire industries or entire sectors.